Units spans the years from 1750 to 1900. Now, the main theme that runs throughout this unit is the massive global changes that occur because of the Industrial Revolution. And in this video, we're going to talk about a new development among the thinky people called the Enlightenment. And in many ways, it was Enlightenment thinking that occasioned the social and political changes that were necessary for the Industrial Revolution. So, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get to it. So, the Enlightenment. Shall we begin with a definition? The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement of the 18th century that advocated the use of reason to reconsider the accepted ideas and social institutions of the time. Or, to put it another way, the scientific revolution and the humanism of the Renaissance got together and had a baby. Oh, look at the baby! Did you poo-poo all over the millennial-long habit of discerning truth through tradition and religious revelation? Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Alright, let me just say it plain. The emphasis of the Enlightenment was the application of human reason to natural law. The thinkers during this time began to see that the world and the fullness thereof was ordered by a set of natural laws, and if only we could tap into the wisdom of those natural laws and apply them to our society, then progress would occur. Prior to this, societies understood reality because it was revealed to them by the Bible or by the Quran or by traditions or ancestors. And the big revolution of Enlightenment thought was that we are no longer accepting as true anything that comes from outside of us. It's the working of our minds and the understanding of the natural laws that will lead us to truth. Now, the contrast I just made is far too simplistic to describe the complex reality of all that, but at least it helps you understand why the Enlightenment was such a big deal. Okay, now let's talk about where all these powerful ideas came from. And we'll start with Francis Bacon and the idea of empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that reality is discerned through the senses, like the sight and the hearing and the smell and the taste and the touch. Therefore, the only way to really know the nature of reality is through the senses. And this idea took the old way of knowing truth and reality and kicked it in the face like a crazed donkey. As I mentioned before, the old way of knowing truth was by revelation, and in the case of Europe, that meant the Bible. The truths in the Bible come to us from outside the world and tell us what reality is like. Empiricism, on the other hand, says that we're going to figure out what reality is like and what it means through our senses and our brainful. And how are we going to do that? Well, by running scientific experiments to determine what is true and what is false. Also, we've got John Locke making contributions to the political side of things through his book, Two Treatises on Government. He argued that the whole divine right of kings thing was a deeply flawed organization of the political hierarchy. Rather, human beings are endowed with natural rights like life and liberty and property. And those rights are not granted by a king, but by virtue of being a living human being, and as such, it is human beings who ought to have the power in a government. And Locke explained that human beings and their government were in a social contract together. And that just means that if it's true that the power to govern is in the hands of the people, then the social contract means this, that they willingly give up some of that power to a government who is willing to protect their natural rights. And implicit in this agreement is the following, that if the government ends up being a turd, then the people have the right to flush it. Now, one of the consequences of this kind of thinking as applied to politics was revolution. Enlightenment principles like the equality of all human beings led to the breakup of empires and the proliferation of constitutional governments around the world. It also led to a growing nationalism in many places. And just in case you forgot, nationalism is a strong identification of a group of people who share an ethnic identity and a language. You see, prior to this, people tended to be loyal to a ruler or a city. And with this rise of nationalism, people are now loyal to a nation. And this is a big deal because, in case you forgot, Europe had spent centuries building up multi-ethnic empires. And this new nationalistic fervor threatened those empires from every side. All right, let's shift and talk about Enlightenment principles as applied to economics. And for this, I need to introduce you to Adam Smith. In 1776, he published a massively consequential book called The Wealth of Nations, which was his critique of the mercantilist economies of Europe. You see, economics under mercantilism required a heavy hand from the government. Smith, on the other hand, argued for laissez-faire economics, which is French for let alone. So Smith's economic replacement for mercantilism, namely capitalism, was the idea that the government needed to take their hands off and just let things go. Essentially, Smith argued that if individuals were left alone to make their own individual economic choices, then those choices that they make would eventually, being guided by the invisible hand of the market, benefit all of society. Okay, now let's look at how the Enlightenment affected religion. Because of this new way of thinking, people began to re-examine their relationship with God. As you know, Christianity was the dominant religion of the Europeans during this time. And if you've ever read the Christian scriptures, you'll know that the God of the Bible often intervenes in history. But the new brand of enlightened religion was called deism. And in deism, the idea was that yes, there was a God, and that God created all things in the beginning. But that God does not intervene in history. Rather, God is like a cosmic watchmaker who put all the gears and springs in place, which is to say the natural laws, wound the thing up, and now is letting it tick away without any concern. So, in this system, if you want to know God, then you discover his ways through the contemplation of natural laws. Now, with all of this upheaval and change in thought patterns, you should know that not everyone embraced the Enlightenment's pattern for change, and the people who resisted it were known as conservatives. And conservatism, by definition, is a strong belief in tradition and the shunning of ideology in favor of practical ideas. I'm not going to explain specific conservatives here, but it's enough to know that they existed and that they resisted this revolution of thought. Okay, now let's just talk briefly about some of the long-standing institutions that were affected by Enlightenment thought, namely women and the abolition of slavery. So with all this Enlightenment talk about human beings being invested with natural rights just by virtue of being human beings, the women looked up and said, what about us? Now, if you know anything about world history, you know that pretty much in every society, the outlook on women is pretty bleak. In fact, maybe your good buddy Aristotle can sum up the general view of women in many societies. He thought that a woman was an inadequate and infertile male who plays only a passive role in reproduction and is incapable of rational thought. Now, just to be clear, that's not what I believe, but I think it's a pretty good summary of what most cultures in society have believed about women. But because of the Enlightenment, many women found power in their voices that they had not yet accessed heretofore. In England, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she argued for women's education and claimed that women, given a chance, could succeed in every endeavor which were reserved exclusively for men, like politics or professional society. Over in the United States, a conference called the Seneca Falls Convention was called to rally for women's rights, including women's suffrage, which is to say the right to vote. And they composed at their gathering the Declaration of Sentiments, which borrowed heavily from the American Declaration of Independence, but with some key changes. For example, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And as a result, these women argued that women ought to be less dependent on their husbands in terms of property and income. But the Enlightenment also affected the institutions of slavery and serfdom. Again, because of the Enlightenment ideal that all human beings are created with certain unalienable rights, the abolitionist movement began to gather steam. In the United States, the slave trade was banned in 1808, but between that year and the middle of the 19th century, the population of enslaved people in America grew dramatically. And at this point, the fight between the slaveholders and the abolitionists grew to a fever pitch, which eventually led to the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. And on a shorter note, in Russia, due in part to Enlightenment thought, 23 million serfs were emancipated. All right, that's what you need to know about the Enlightenment for Unit 5 of AP World History. If you're feeling enlightened by this video, then hit that like button. Your sense perception will tell you it's the right thing to do. If you need help in AP World History, then subscribe and come along. And finally, if you want to prove Adam Smith right about voluntary economic contributions being better for society, then let the invisible hand of the free market guide you to go join the community of Heimlich History supporters over on Patreon. Heimler out. Hey, and welcome back to Heimlich History. In the last video, we started talking about Unit 5 of AP World History by talking about the Enlightenment, and in that movement, the thinky people of Europe introduced some very provocative ideas into the world that had some massive political consequences. And we're going to look at those specific consequences in this video, namely nationalism and political revolution. So, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get to it. So let's start with some revolution. Now, if you watched the last video on the Enlightenment, you may remember that some of the most consequential teachings of the Enlightenment had to do with natural rights and the social contract. Our buddy John Locke described natural rights as those rights that are given human beings by God, which is to say, not the government. And for Locke, those rights were life, liberty, and property. And if that's true, then that means that human beings are in a social contract with their government. So the social contract means that the power to rule is by nature in the hands of the people, and that means that they willingly give over some of that power to a government who in turn protects their natural rights. And so as a result of all this teaching, people started getting the idea that governments ought to protect their rights, and governments ought to run by democratic processes, and governments ought to be constitutional in nature. Those ideas started taking hold all over the world. And the first place they really took hold and caused a revolution was in the British colonies of North America. The American Revolution occurred for many reasons, not least of which was that over time, the colonies had grown functionally independent of the British Crown. I mean, first of all, there was a giant ocean division separating the colonies from the motherland. Second of all, the colonies grew increasingly suspicious of the crown because although the colonists had precisely no representation in the British Parliament, the government kept levying taxes on the colonists, and these taxes were becoming more and more odious. And so on July 4th, 1776, the British colonies of America declared their independence and became the United States of America. Ooh, baby, am I the only one who wants to high-five a bald eagle right now? Now, this is important because the Declaration of Independence, penned by our good buddy Thomas Jefferson, was positively suffused with Enlightenment thinking, namely John Locke's Enlightenment thinking. Let me give you an example. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. There's the natural rights doctrine. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And that right there is the social contract. And it was surely not a foregone conclusion that these fledgling colonies in the Americas would actually win against the British Empire. But with a little help from the French, that's exactly what they did. And by 1783, the United States of America was officially outside of the thumb of the British Empire and were a nation of their own. Now, the American Revolution provided inspiration for another revolution that occurred only a few years later, namely the French Revolution. So by the 1780s, France was like shoulders deep in economic woes, mainly caused by war spending. And in order to solve that problem, King Louis XVI called in 1789 a meeting of the Estates General. And the Estates General was an official body that represented the three estates of the French population, namely the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. And even though the third estate represented like 98% of the population, they still had an equal vote with the other two estates, the clergy and the nobility, which really only represented about 2% of the population. Now, the third estate may have been less educated, but they could do that kind of math, and what that kind of math told them was that the other two estates were taking a representative dump on them. So, as a result, the third estate broke away and formed their own representative body called the National Assembly, and when Louis XVI heard about such insolence, he threatened to arrest the leaders of the National Assembly, and in response to that, on July 14th, 1789, an angry crowd stormed the Bastille, which was a prison that, in the eyes of the people, symbolized monarchical abuse and the corruption of the aristocracy. And this fervor spread throughout France, inciting peasants from all over to rise up against their nobles. The result of all of this was significant. Louis XVI was forced to accept a new governmental arrangement that gave significant voice to the National Assembly. And out of all of this, a new document was produced, and wouldn't you know it, that document's cup runneth over with Enlightenment thought. It was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and it was deeply influenced by the American Declaration of Independence and included protections of basic human rights and provided for a limited monarchy. Now, that last part, as you can imagine, was not favorable to Louis XVI. He fought against it, and that initiated a period of the French Revolution called the Reign of Terror, which culminated in the beheading of the king. Now, across the sea, France had a colony in a little island called Haiti, and that's where our third revolution occurred. Now, this colony, in terms of population, was mainly made up of two different groups of people. There were a few French plantation owners, and then there was a huge population of enslaved Africans who were working for the plantation owners. And so as the National Assembly back in France flooded the streets yelling out liberty and they're beheading kings because they deserve freedom from tyranny, the slave population in Haiti is like, yeah, those seem like some pretty good ideas. And so the enslaved population of Haiti rose up in revolution against their masters and killed many of them and burned their houses as well. In 1791, a Haitian named Toussaint Louverture took charge and led the rebellion against the French enslavers. And much like the American Revolution, it was altogether surprising when the Haitians actually clinched a victory against the French and established an independent Haitian government. It was the first successful revolution of enslaved people and the first black-led independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. Now, so far, most of these revolutions have had happy endings, but that is not always the case. That was true in the case of the New Zealand Wars. So the British annexed New Zealand in 1840 and established dominance over the natives, which were known as the Maori. And as is the case with almost every colonial endeavor that we've studied in this course, the natives of New Zealand did not take kindly to being ruled by foreign whiteys. And so the Maori tribes joined together in order to fight against the British and expel them from their land. But by 1872, the British had crushed the rebellion and clamped down even tighter on the Maori. The final revolution we're going to consider happened over in Latin America. Now, recall from the last unit that when Europeans introduced themselves into the Americas, it created a completely new new social hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy were the Peninsulares, who were those who were born in Europe. Under them were the Creoles, and they were like the B-grade Europeans because they were Europeans, but they were born in the Americas. And so with a growing awareness of revolutions that are occurring throughout the world and the profusion of Enlightenment thought into their daily lives, the Creoles began thinking of revolting themselves. Now, the Creoles were discontent for a few reasons. First, many Creoles were extraordinarily wealthy because of their agricultural pursuits, but because of the mercantilist policies of Spain, they were losing a huge chunk of their profits. And the second reason Creoles were discontent is because they were often passed over for positions of authority which were summarily reserved for Peninsulares. And so, under the leadership of Simón Bolívar, the Creoles rose up against Spain. He was extraordinarily successful and gained a huge chunk of territory that he called Gran Colombia. And this movement, too, had a document that outlined its values, and those values were shot through with Enlightenment thought. In Bolívar's letter from Jamaica, he argued for the necessity of constitutional republics, of natural rights, and for democratic ideals in the governing of the people of Latin America. Okay, those are the big revolutions occurring during this time period, but there's also something at the core of all these revolutions that all of them share, and that is a sense of nationalism. In case you forgot, nationalism is like a force that binds people together who share the same ethnic identity and language. And when people start feeling that, they often long to be united under a single political unit. So the last thing we need to talk about in this video is how nationalism led to the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany. And these unifications weren't really revolutions, but they did draw energy from the same sources. So let's begin with Italian unification. So since the fall of Rome many centuries before, the Italian peninsula had been divided into independent and competing states. So in 1848, the prime minister of one of those states, by the name of Count Cavour, led the charge to unify Italy under his house, the House of Savoy. Now, since this house was the only native Italian dynasty, it only made sense to him that the entire nation ought to be united under his rule. And long story short, through strategic alliances and battles, he was able to unite Italy. And German unification was somewhat similar. In 1848, the Prussian leader Otto von Bismarck engineered 3 wars that united the German people in spirit against the enemy. And in 1871, he united them in a nation when he founded the new unified German Empire. All right, that's what you need to know about revolutions and nationalism for Unit 5 of AP World History. If you feel an identification with the
word for word, I mean, we're not looking for spot checking words. We don't do that. We have to read every single word on your.
Next time you do this, you could be doing this. How?
It's basically the process of making goods with machines in order to make labor more efficient. So basically, we went from making stuff with our hands to making stuff with machines. But this shift in the method of production of goods led to worldwide changes in social and economic structures on such a massive scale that it's going to be hard for me to exaggerate the magnitude of its effects. And that's what the rest of the videos in this unit are going to explore. But for now, we're going to look at what caused the Industrial Revolution to begin. It just so happened that it started in the country of England. Now, why England? Well, I got 8 reasons for you. Number 1, proximity to water. As my grandpappy used to say, son, you can't bust a grumpy in England without running into some water somewhere. Thanks, grandpappy. But it's true. England is an island, and no matter where you lived on this island, there was abundant access to rivers and canals. And this is important because it created the conditions for easy and inexpensive trade. Reason number 2, metric buttloads of raw materials. Under the surface of England's soil lay huge deposits of coal, which would be the main source of energy powering the Industrial Revolution. Also, there were abundant deposits of iron, which, thanks to new methods of separating iron from its ore, was used to create the infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution. Reason number 3, increased agricultural productivity. So there were some significant advances in agriculture during this time that increased harvests abundantly. A new method of planting was embraced, namely crop rotation. And this was kind of a big deal because if you plant the same crops in the ground year after year, those crops are going to use the same nutrients in the soil. And after a period of time, that soil isn't going to be fertile anymore. But if you rotate crops, that is, you plant different crops in the soil year after year, then they're using different nutrients of the soil, and that makes the soil much more productive. Also, there was the invention of a new tool called the seed drill, which enabled farmers to place seeds in the ground at the exact right location and depth. Reason number 4, urbanization. Now, because of all these improvements in agriculture, there was more food available. And as is the case in most of world history, when there's more food, people will be making more babies, and that means the population increases. But combine that agricultural increase with an advancing efficiency in farming techniques, and you've got a bunch of people growing up on farms that no longer needed their labor. So there result of this was a huge migration of people from rural areas into the urban areas or cities. Reason number 5, legal protection of private property. This was important because it enabled entrepreneurs to take risks and build businesses without the fear that the government or some other business was going to take away what they worked for. Reason number 6, access to foreign resources. It's true that England had strategic raw materials buried under their own soil, but let's not forget what England had been busy doing in the last period, namely creating a global empire. One of the cushy benefits of that was this: they had access to all the raw materials of their colonies, and because they had colonies in all parts of the globe, there was basically nothing that they couldn't get if they wanted it. And reason number 7, the accumulation of capital. Largely because of wealth generated by the African slave trade, British capitalists had accumulated a huge amount of capital, and that meant they had the occasion to invest that capital into new entrepreneurial opportunities should they arise. And they did. Okay, now those are 7 macro conditions that enabled the Industrial Revolution to occur. But let's zoom in and look at the 8th reason on more of a micro scale, and that is the advent of the factory system. So a factory is just a place where goods for sale are manufactured. But people have always made goods for sale. What makes the factory special? Well, what makes a factory special is that it's capable of producing those goods in mass. You see, prior to the factory, if a good was going to be made for sale, like a chair, an artisan or a skilled laborer had to make that chair from beginning to end, and that made the production of goods very slow. But here's where I introduce you to the father of the factory, Richard Arkwright. In 1769, he invented the water frame, and this was a wheel that you could stick in moving water and get it to spin. And you may be saying, so what? Well, wait a second. Let me further introduce you to James Hargreaves, who invented the spinning jenny in 1760. This little contraption made it possible for weavers to produce cloth at a much faster rate, and if you take the water frame and you hook it up to a spinning jenny, then baby, you got a machine making textiles faster than any human being ever could. And that was, in the simplest terms, the birth of the factory. But it wasn't just the method of production that changed, labor changed as well. Here's where I introduce you to Eli Whitney. He came up with the notion of interchangeable parts, and here's what that means. Whitney's application of this idea was to guns. Now remember, before this, people made things basically one at a time, so that trigger was made for that gun, and it wouldn't fit any other gun. But Whitney thought, why don't we make parts that fit every gun so that if a trigger goes bad on that one, then you can just put another standardized trigger on it. And so now the manufacture of goods was focused not on whole products, but on the individual parts of the products. And when that happened, it meant producers no longer had to rely on skilled laborers to produce their goods for sale. Instead, anyone could stand at that one spot on an assembly line and could fit that cog into that hole, and they could do it over and over and over again. And so with the combining of those new technologies and this new system of labor, the factory system was born. All right, that's what you need to know about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution for Unit 5 of AP World History. If you feel like you've mined some valuable raw materials from this video, then hit subscribe and I'll keep making them for you. If you want to help create a video-based revolution for AP World History, then you can join